I'll let everyone in once you're good to go.
Continue. Continue. Let me slip around and get the other one. And then I think we're all right. Yeah, this is a big help. This is a big help.
Perfect.
Okay, I think I just have to sit down and I'm ready to go.
All right.
Okay. Time for fun.
All right, I'm gonna start letting everyone in then.
I don't seem to, can you hear me? I don't seem to have audio, or is it gonna be quiet while everybody's coming in?
I can hear you, Franz. You're okay.
Okay, good. Yeah, just want to make sure.
Okay. Looks like we still have a few more people in the waiting room, so I'll wait till that number goes down. Okay, it looks like everyone is with us, so welcome. Thank you everyone for coming to this workshop that Franz is going to be leading us through. My name is Krista, I'm from Faber-Castell. If you have any questions as we go through the session this evening, you can chat me with the Ask Me Questions. Otherwise, Franz will be leading us today, and with that, I'm going to let him take it away. It's all yours, Franz.
Okay, thank you, Krista. Welcome everybody. We're going to talk about colored pencils. There are two primary groups, the watercolor pencils, which are totally magical, and the more kind of traditional pencil, which are stupendous. So either choice, I think we're going to have a lot of fun. Now, what I wanted to do is maybe start off and kind of talk a little bit about the pencils by way of examples. So if we could switch over to my handy little iPad camera. We'll go to that one. Okay, now this is an example of the two different types of colored pencils that we'll be talking about. On the head side are the water-soluble pencils, and on the tail side are the Polychromos. That's Faber-Castell's traditional oil-based pencil. And the reason I showed this was that it kind of gives you an idea that what Faber-Castell has done is they've come up with a system of pigments called index coloring, so that whether you're using a watercolor pencil or an oil-based pencil, it has the same pigment. And I'll be showing you some techniques where you'll be using both types of pencils at the same time. So you want to make sure that whatever you're doing is going to be consistent. So that was in my sketchbook, and then we'll get to the next one. This is an example. There actually is more fish in here. It isn't like he's been cut off, but I wanted to show the fish head as opposed to this fish head. This fish head was done with the oil-based pencils, and the other one was a combination of the two. Here, we'll get this one there. And so the pigmentation is the same, but the intensity is a little bit different, because using just the regular color pencil, you're putting all the pigment on the top surface of the paper. So you have a little bit of the paper coming through. So it's going to mute the color a little bit because of that. And then the other fish head that looks a little bit richer, that was done primarily because it looks a little bit richer because the watercolor pigment actually is soaked up and absorbed by the paper. So it's no longer white paper. It's whatever color the watercolor was. And then with the other color pencil on top, it kind of gives you a very rich tone. Now, just for those of you that aren't necessarily into realism or feel like a little intimidated by that, this is my normal style. I mean, that's the type of goofy stuff that, you know, I illustrate kids' books and other things. And this is kind of more of the traditional, my traditional look. And it brings up the point that no matter like what level you are, whether you're a beginner, whether you've been doing this for years or whatever. The object is not necessarily always to be a realist, but it is to be somebody to express who you really are and what you want to do. So a lot of the techniques that I will be showing you can be used for all sorts of styles, but the most important thing is for you to figure out what is best for you. What do you want to do? You know, don't feel like you have to be like anybody else. You develop your direction, and I will be giving the tools and the techniques that can help you along your path, but don't feel like you have to do anything that looks like I do, even though I have a fairly wide range there, from fish wearing derby to one that looks like, you know, you could catch it. And so I also thought, with this camera, what I wanted to do, this is the image. I did a demo drawing, and this is the image that I'm going to be working on. And I thought, if you wanted to work along with me, you could take your phone out right now and take a photograph of this. And then I'll get the top derby off there, so that shows up. And then that way, I mean, you can pick whatever still life material, or it could be abstract patterns out of your head, or whatever it is that you want to do. But if you want to kind of follow along some of the steps that I'll be doing, then if you take a photograph of this with your camera right now, then as you're working, you could refer to your phone screen in order to kind of get a feeling for it. And then additionally, I don't know if this is going to show up. Yep, I think it's got too much light on it. What I did is a line drawing that would be kind of like a kind of a paint by number thing. But maybe what I'll do is put that face down, and you can take the picture from when it's on the overhead thing. Okay, so why don't we get started? And we can switch over to the overhead camera, and you can actually see what we're going to be doing. Okay, this is the drawing that I did of that scene, and it was done with the Polychromos. That's the name that Faber-Castell uses for their oil-based pencils. And at looking at this, you think, okay, what is that? Well, it's a vintage tablecloth. I've started a series of pastel drawings where I find these very odd and curious objects, usually some kind of ceramic thing. And on this one, I put it on a like a 1940s, 1950s kitchen tablecloth. And so this is actually an ashtray that was, I think it's German, but I found it really curious. And it also looked like it'd be a fun thing to draw. Not that difficult, a little bit challenging, and I lit it. So, you know, I was kind of thinking, okay, that we'll use this as an example of, you know, things that you can do. So if I can get this one, I don't know if maybe, does this show up well enough that you could take a picture of it? Okay, so yeah, let me reposition it. So if you want to get your cameras out one more time, if you take a picture of this, it's kind of the line sketch I did in order to get started on the drawing. And then, you know, later on, if you want a guide to kind of help you, you'll have the photograph of the setup as well as a photograph of the line thing. And then you can kind of fill in and expand it or whatever. I was just trying to figure out a way to kind of make things a little more coherent. Okay, so now to get those out of the way. Now, in dealing with any kind of a drawing process, or if you're painting, whatever, the materials are really important. And so first thing I want to do is talk about paper. And so with the color pencils, it's a really good idea to work on paper that is like 100% cotton fiber. This is the Stonehenge paper, both regular and this is Stonehenge Light. Works really well for color pencil. It has a slight tooth to it, and the way that we're going to be developing it is the drawing is going to depend on that tooth. And then, so you want to make sure that you have the good materials, and which then brings up the pencils themselves. Now, the reason that I use these Faber-Castell pencils, they're really well made. And so let me grab one here. We'll just talk about it a little bit. These pencils are oil-based, and that means that, you know, the thing that kind of helps keep them together is an oil-based rather than a wax-based. Some people prefer wax, some prefer oil. I like the oil-based because you can layer and layer and layer. They're very soft, they're very vibrant, really bright color. So over here in the border, and the other thing too is the way that you hold a pencil has a lot to do. Instead of holding a pencil the way that you would write somebody a letter, try holding it kind of at the end. And then if you want a light tone, you just let the weight of the paper or the pencil, as you move it back and forth, it's going to build up tones. All right, and you can kind of see that slight texture in the paper is kind of keeping it from being totally solid. Now, if I want to make that darker, I just put in a little more pressure and I go over it and I go over it and I go over it. And so with one pencil, you can get a nice range of tones depending on how much pressure you're using and how many times you go over. So what I'm doing is depositing the pigment on the top surface of the paper, all right? Now, even if I would really bear down hard on it, now the reason I don't want to do this too soon is that it will change the surface of your paper. You know, instead of it being still kind of textured and putting the pigment on the tops, I'm forcing the pigment down into the valleys as well. But you can see that you can get a really nice range of the tone of that color. So I can feather it out again. Now, the advantage of the oil-based is I can keep on adding pigment and pigment. With the wax pencils, what can happen is that because it's wax, you get to a point and you can't put any more down again. And instead, what you'll be doing is you'll start picking it up. So instead of your thing getting darker, it's going to start having these little skid marks where you're actually picking wax up. Now, I'll take another pencil. Let's take something that's a bit different. Let's take a blue. And I can do the same thing with the blue pencil. And also, just a real quick, again, tools of the trade. Use a hand sharpener for your pencils. Don't use an electric one. Don't use an office pencil. They'll chew them up. The standard office pencil has a much harder lead, and when you get into especially a really good color pencil, whether it's a wax or an oil-based, the leads are a lot softer, and so those industrial type of sharpeners will eat your pencil alive. So use a hand sharpener when it comes to sharpening your pencils. So I can do the same thing. You know, I can start holding the pencil a certain way, going along here, and then I can build up even tones, and then with a little more pressure, I start getting, you know, up to maximum capacity of the paper, and then I can really load it up and it gets very solid. So, all right, you can kind of see some, but this is the magic of the oil-based pencil, is that I can go right on top of what I've already done with another color. And this is important too, is that, you know, these pencils come in 120 colors, but they also have sets that are 12, a starter set with a, you know, kind of more primary. And so if you don't have a color, you can make your own color up by overlapping. So you can kind of see how the advantage being able to layer is of great importance, especially if you start off with, you know, like a limited number of colors. Well, you just keep on layering and layering. And the other thing too is it really kind of creates an additional effect. It's almost like there's a transparency here, and you can see with a slightly smaller deposit of pigment with the blue on top of this orangish color, you can see where you got little bits of that orange that are kind of coming through, and that's quite nice. And you could really use that to your advantage in terms of creating a feeling of, you know, the color and the way that you're kind of shading things if you're looking to shade them. But, you know, I could keep on adding it and get it so that it is predominantly blue and almost totally cover up that orange. And I feel like, you know, one of the TV advertisers. Not only you get one, you get two, but we'll send you for absolutely free something else. Well, yeah, you can just keep on adding color. You don't have to stop at two. It's like, no, wait, can you do two? At some point, it's going to be very subtle changes, but I can put a third color on top of that. So you can kind of see the way that this bottom is really changing. So, to me, it's just, you have this kind of real nice, warm, glowing orange color, and then you start filtering it through, and then you have this really rich color underneath it. So there's three. And we could do a fourth one on top of that. Yeah, oops, let's get one more. I'll have to sharpen it. So I can even come back, and now all of a sudden that's kind of turning that darker green into a lighter green. And so, it could be a really nice situation here where you're going from, kind of a warm color to cooler colors. Now we're warming things up again. So it just gives you a lot more flexibility, a wider range of effects that you can accomplish by layering and layering and layering. And I found it really helpful when I was doing our odd friend here. Let's see, I'll try to get him in the picture. This will be kind of fun. He'll be watching me draw too, because it's just there are a couple of tones in here that are a little bit odd, and I can expand my ability to render those if I do a little bit of extra layering. So let's get started a little bit. Maybe actually we'll just kind of put them here out of the way because I'll be drawing here. We can start working maybe with the head. Oh, I don't want a shadow in the way. Up on the top. Now the other thing that is I recommend doing, okay, once you kind of have an idea of, working with the pencils and stuff, depending on what type of art you want to do. If you want to do something that's very realistic, then you really need to kind of observe things like highlights and shadows and whatnot. And even though his hat is blue, when you really look at it, there are quite a few different tones. Like, from my viewpoint, this is white. It's if I move it, you can see how the highlight disappears and it's blue again. But it's as if somebody's come through and has painted white spots on that. And these are maybe not quite. So that's where, if you kind of can control the deposit and how much of the paper is still showing through, you don't necessarily have to figure out how am I going to make that white, because you can just use the paper itself. All right, so I'm going to have it. It's about like that, I guess. So I'll kind of look at what my view is. And so, this is a blue, maybe, yeah, I like this blue. This is a good one. So what I would do is very lightly start building up, an overall sense of blue. And I've kind of marked out where my highlights are. And so I kind of want to avoid putting any blue on top of those right away. And I have, because the lighting is a little bit different than when I sketched this out, I also have a bit of a highlight up here. So this is why depositing the blue kind of in a gradual way is very helpful, because it'll prevent you from covering up highlights and going too dark too soon. I mean, you can always go darker. All right, so we'll continue, and then we'll get this section as well. Now there's some highlights that are coming across here that are a little bit different, so I'll make sure that I leave those in. And then it gets a little bit darker. But even though it gets darker and I have the shadows, I kind of want to put in the overall color first. Now, again, this is, these are kind of suggestions on how you might be using these pencils for something that is rendered a little more realistically. And again, that's not the only way to use these pencils. I would say that probably 80% of the times that I've used them have been for my children's book illustrations, and they're not realistic. But the idea of shadows and highlights are still relevant. So whether you're doing something that is highly representational or something that is a little bit more whimsical, you can still use the same, general principles of how to determine where the light's coming from, shadows, highlights, and then find appropriate ways of using materials in order to make that happen. Okay, so then this is pretty much just, and I drew these guidelines a little bit darker than I normally would so that they would show up a little bit better for our purposes. What I probably would do is maybe use a light blue in sketching out the hat and all that, and try to kind of match a similar tone to what's going to be around it. But that's okay. Here we go, like that. Okay, so that's the start. Now I can kind of look at it and start thinking about, all right, let's make some of this a little bit darker. So it looks like, and a lot of times too, if the light is coming from a certain direction and you have a highlight, you still, a lot of times, if you have like kind of an organic form, the leading edge is going to be darker, and then you kind of work into this highlight, and then I'm going to come back and kind of crowd that a little bit more.
Hey, Franz, if you
Yes.
could move the paper a little bit towards you,
Oh, yeah.
see the whole
Yeah.
picture. There you go. Perfect.
Okay, yeah, good. I get so involved with what I'm doing, it's like I'm kind of oblivious to
No worries.
what's happening. Okay,
Looks
so
great.
now, all right, so now I'm going to start stepping up the pressure just a little bit, so I can kind of move along. Now, I've got a shadow that goes beyond here, that kind of comes down around like that. This is kind of a lighter blue because this little button on top of his head is actually raised. So it's going to be a light blue too. But now I'm going to look to see what I've got, and it's like, okay, here's a slightly darker blue. Or if you have like a basic starting set, then you could maybe use a purple or something like that. So I'm going to come back and I'm going to start stepping things up a little bit and making that just a little bit darker. And then just a tiny bit darker here. And then this is that shadow I was talking about. So, and I'm not pressing down hard. I don't want to score the paper. Because like if I'm really, I know, I'm sure everybody at some point has seen the film noir detective movies or even Westerns or something where somebody's been murdered or whatever, they're missing, and they go to their place and look at the desk and there's a notepad. And the top message has been removed, but they notice there's something on it, and they take a pencil and they rub it up, and then, because they press so hard into the paper, it reveals, the message. That's what happens when you take your pencil and you really go down on top. So if I try to erase that, I may have a hard time getting rid of the color because these are really soft. These oil pencils are really soft. But not only that, but I have created a damage to the surface of the paper so that, if I go on top of that, I mean, you can almost hear it. It's almost like running your fingers over a washboard. And so you can see how disruptive that is visually to see what then becomes another dark line again, even though I erased it, in trying to keep a real consistent surface here. So you want to be a little careful about that type of thing, and you save those real hard, heavily deposited bits of the pigment until you're almost done, and for sure that All right, let's. Oh, now I moved my guy. I'm not sure if the light's going to be the same, but it'll be close enough. Okay, so here we go. These start to curve down, and so they're getting less light, and so they're going to be a little bit darker, everything here, and as it curves up, then it's going to get a little bit lighter. And so I'm planning to have this be a little bit lighter up here, I have my highlight here, but instead of being so hard edged, I'm going to feather it a little bit so it kind of hints at it. Okay, so we're making some progress here. And yeah, I'm not going to spend the entire time, kind of just carefully rendering it because it would take days to do that. But I just kind of wanted to give you an idea of how to start and certain things that you can kind of look for. Now, kind of when you get down into these little troughs into here, in order to kind of make it look like that's actually, I don't know if I can put it someplace where you could see that. When I look at it, I can see that down here in the valley, it's a lot darker. So I have a little more control, but I'm using very little pressure. And then I've got this part in through here, but there's a highlight that kind of goes scooting across there. So as I start adding the pigment, I'm going to accommodate a feeling for a highlight. And then as it comes up, this is down in the trough, so it's kind of away from light. But this part up here is light, so I will leave it as it is. And then this is just a little bit darker yet. So you start working on different gradients of how dark the pencil is. You might start with 2 or 3 pencils to really make that even darker, even richer. I can come again with a darker blue. And so you can see with that contrast, I mean, a lot of times you don't necessarily have to outline something, but if you make an edge in contrast in terms of how light or dark something is, you can start to see how you get a little bit more volume out of something. I'll come back and maybe now I'll add just a little bit dark here. And if you feel like you have a really bright highlight, what I might do is if I find my eraser here, I'll come in and maybe kind of, if anything has kind of gone over there. With the oil-based pencils, I find sometimes with these highlights, if you put, if you're very certain that you know where that highlight is, you can put a fairly thick area so that even if you go over it with another pencil, then it'll be easier to erase because you have a nice layering there. Okay, so let's very quickly kind of get some of this done. Now this is black. I mean, most of the times with shadows and stuff, I like using dark purples to make the shadows darker, but when something's black, then there's nothing wrong with a good black pencil. Now the other thing too, if I could refer to my original drawing here, let me bring that up quickly. Okay, if you can see, this is a tablecloth, and so I kind of wanted to contrast the surface of the hat, which is really shiny, with the tablecloth. So even though I build up the color quite a bit, there are places in the hat that I really put a lot of pigment with a lot of pressure. So it actually was smooth. I got rid of the papery texture in the background. But since this is cloth, and you would expect there to be, even if it's a real fine cloth, you'll still have a bit of texture to it. So I never got to the point that I felt like I was getting rid of that little kind of pebbly look. So in other words, like with this, if I were doing something with a black line, especially on a cloth, I might start off with kind of a light thing like that and a little texture like that. Let's say that I've got a fold or something. And it could be an orange cloth in between. Getting ready for Halloween. Tablecloth that is orange and black. Okay, so it can be something like that. Let's say. Okay, then when it comes to doing the shading in it, then perhaps, what I could do is actually get a red or a red-orange. And again, I don't want to get rid of that texture. because it is cloth, you'd have a certain kind of feeling for it being cloth, the texture of the cloth. And so maybe it has another fold over here, but we'll just go with that. And maybe instead of making it like a pure black, let's go, let's get kind of a maroonish color to kind of help that one out a little bit. Okay, so I think you start getting the idea. Maybe, you know, maybe there's just a slight feathers it out a little bit. So that's going to be kind of more appropriate for cloth because cloth has texture. But then when I'm looking at the ceramic glossy glaze on Mr. Clownhead here, then once I kind of identify where my highlights are and see if they're, you know, some, you know, that's pretty much the light that I have that I'm looking at right now, pretty much has it, you know, it's a little bit lighter kind of up in there, but for the most part, it's pretty dark. So I feel a little more emboldened to kind of come through, use extra pressure, and really fill that paper up, because now this is going to kind of give you the impression of something that's shiny. And especially if I have this effect and that effect, then it's really that contrast between something that looks shiny and reflective as opposed to something that is textured and less reflective, then it's going to give you, you know, a variety of visual effects that will really enhance your drawing. And again, that's, you know, you could use that whether you're doing something abstractly or if you're doing something that's a little more whimsical. All that holds true. It's just up to you to decide how you're going to express yourself. Okay, so I don't know if that comes through on the camera or not, but that's going to look a lot different. Now, this is shiny too, and so that's why if you have a matte surface with kind of a little bit of light on it, you're going to have a glow. But if you have an extremely shiny surface like that, the button on the top of his head, of his hat, the highlights are going to be pure white. They are just going to really bounce out. So what I might do is kind of come through and say, okay, well, let's really get some of those in there. And this one was a little less from my angle. And I can just put just a little bit in through there. So now it has kind of a dimension, but it really pops it off the surface. And then, you know, if I enhance it even more by coming back and getting that shadow in there so that it really reads as being distinctively darker compared to what's around, and it's kind of this really nice shape. And kind of put that in. And then up around here, I'm reading that there's this collar comes around, and so it's light on that side of it, but it gets a little bit darker up and through here. So you see, with just a little manipulation with your tones and your values, you can make things look much more dimensional and also be a little more descriptive in terms of the surface that your object's made on. Okay, so yeah, we could do, I mean, I will have to admit my favorite part of doing this was the eyeballs. They were really a lot of fun. Maybe we'll do one very quickly. But again, if you look at where the shadows are, so that you have these deep sockets in through here, so that the tone, again, I want to start off nice and lightly because I want to make sure that I can make it darker if I need to, or maintain it for a little lighter, more subtle things. And then the eyeball itself, if I look at it, I can kind of see that the back part of it has the value that comes through about there. It's a little bit darker there. And a lot of times with spherical things, like if I want to draw kind of like a, let's see, make sure I get this position where you can see it. Actually, I don't even want to do that. I am going to put a very, very light line that's going to disappear. Okay. Now, first off, like if I want that to be a circle, then I can do what was happening here. I can draw a line around it, and that is a circle. And in my, you know, kind of more whimsical illustration style, I can also then kind of come through and do that. And so this has a more graphic look to it, but you know, you can kind of make it look so it's more of a sphere than a flat circle, but that really heavy outline really kind of keeps it as a circle. Now, what I could do instead, I have that guideline, and I'm not going to draw a line. What I'm going to do is create an edge. And for things that are organic, a lot of times it's the edge rather than an outline that you're after. So if I fill something in the negative space, if I, you know, kind of define that shape by coloring around it, all right, so I got that. It has a different appearance than if I had outlined it. You know, it's just kind of floating there. It's kind of glowing. Okay, but I have defined that space by creating an edge through the contrast of blue and nothing. Now, if I want it to be this color, then I can start to put the tones in, and I want to start off light. And let's say that the light's coming down this way, so I'm going to have a highlight there. And I also try to keep my pencils nice and sharp, because as I progress, I have more control with the sharp point. And again, it has to do with, you know, this it didn't make a difference, and I like that look quite a bit. So I didn't have to worry about, you know, maybe my point's a little bit dull. But when you kind of build these tones up gradually, you want to make sure you have a nice sharp point. So I'm going to start doing it where the highlight's going to be kind of in there. But again, I'm not going to kind of outline or anything. Now, as I start to add down here, usually there's some reflective light that makes this part of the sphere a little bit lighter. So now, as I start to add tone, you know, I'm going to put a little bit at the bottom, but then I'm going to allow a little light to be at where I think that there's reflected light. And I'll show you, I've got an example that I think really shows off how effective that can be. Okay, so then up in here is where maybe it really starts to be kind of darker. Okay, and then come through and maybe make that just a little bit darker in there. All right, so it's subtle, but I hope it comes through. And then, you know, if you go ahead and decide, okay, that's the blue there, I'll take a slightly darker blue here and maybe kind of put in a shadow in here. Like I haven't really used any lines per se, but I've played light against dark and created edges by contrast of either color or value. And then if I wanted to, I could really kind of layer it in there. All right. So that's going to give it a little more volume. But, you know, it's up to you. Do you want something to be a little flatter, a little more graphic, a little more whimsical? Do you want something to be a little more realistic? All right. Now, let me just see if I can put my hands on something quick. Yeah. This is an apple that I did with the color pencils, and I think it's a perfect example of kind of what happens. That, you know, you think of the apple as being red and, you know, certain shape, But if you really look at it and see the way that the values are, you've got all sorts of, kind of fun little things in here. Like, this, even though this is really red, it looks like somebody's put paint on there because that's a highlight popping off. But what I wanted to show you is as it comes around, much the same as that sphere, it gets darker. It starts getting darker, partially because the coloration of the apple is such that it's a little bit lighter here anyhow, but you can kind of see that the darkness gives it a form. When it comes down here, not only is it not red, I mean, it's reflecting. This is a nice waxy polished apple. And so, you get a reflection in here. So it's not red anymore. It's the color of what is close to it, the way that it reacts to the light. So it's helpful to be observant about that stuff. And for me, the times that I venture into the land of realistic rendering, it's the challenge for me. I really try to find some way to look at those little key points and all that. So, whether you're doing something like, say, this is, highly rendered. And these, by the way, I wanted to mention this too at some point. Faber-Castell has a studio grade pencil, and they're called Goldfaber pencils, and Michael's has them either in the stores or you can order them online. They are an excellent studio grade pencil, and the reason for it, it's like the index color that I was talking about as far as the pigments. They use the same pigments, and they pretty much use the same formulation for the leads of the studio grade pencil rather than as they do in the really high end pencil. You just get the leads are a little thinner, so they give you less of it. So if you think about it, like let's say you have a really good champagne and you're drinking it in a crystal glass and it's delicious, and let's say you have 4 ounces of it. Well, think about the equivalent with a Goldfaber is that instead of drinking it in a crystal glass, you're drinking it in a really nice glass, still really nice, but it isn't quite up to that real thin crystal, and you just get less champagne. So instead of getting your 4 ounces of champagne, you get 3 ounces of champagne. So if you're a little timid about buying really the high-end materials, you wouldn't go wrong by using those because it's the same pigment. All right, so I think that, as I said, we could render and we could go over this, but, it's pretty much the information about your oil-based pencils that it's just a matter of deciding how you want to use them. Do you want to do something realistic? Do you want to do something that is a little more whimsical and so forth? So now what I want to do is show you the Albrechter watercolor pencils. And these are nice because you can use them as a color pencil, but you can also use them as a watercolor pencil. So I'm going to take one here, and I'm going to, it's the same thing depending on how much pressure. Put that down. Okay, so it has a certain look, but this is, I'm going to take, you can either use a regular brush or this is a water brush. And as soon as I hit that, you can just see like, wow, man, that to me is still just so amazing how intense that color is just by adding a little bit of water. So it shows how highly pigmented these are. So I can kind of move it around, like, instead of having that patterned tablecloth, we've got this one. And depending on how much water you use, or you could use a traditional brush. And it has to do with how much pigment you put down to begin with. That'll determine, how vivid the watercolor is. But to me, that, it's pretty, it's just magical as soon as you hit it with the water. Now, because I use that a lot, okay, if I have, as I pointed out with the fish, let's say you start off with a blue color. I'll make it a little bit darker. I'll keep on building it up so that part of it's dark, and maybe even get a slightly darker blue one, go on top of that. again, the advantage of the oil-based pencils, you can layer and layer and layer. Okay. Okay, so now if I take like a lighter watercolor pencil, I'm going to sharpen this real quick. Also, if you really want to get a sharp point, you can get a sandpaper pad, or you can just get some fine sandpaper, but this is kind of nice because they have it about. And if I twirl it, I'll press it and twirl it. So if I want a really, really fine point, I can create one on a pad. All right, so now what I'm going to do is I'm going to go on top of that. So this kind of orangish color on top of the blue obviously is going to kind of send it over to the green side. But again, what I like about these pencils, the way that you can use them, I mean, that suddenly becomes transparent. So maybe you've got like a blue thing in through here, and then you can just see that there's a transparent layer on top of that. So it could be, you know, maybe the sun's coming in here. This is more in the shadows. You could find different ways of using that. But again, this time, maybe I'll just use a traditional brush. When I go over that, you can see the way that the speckles still stay there. So I have this nice texture, and it makes it even more transparent because it's obvious that there's that texture underneath it. So, you know, you might have to work on it a little bit depending on how much you put down, but you can kind of control that effect by just adding more water and moving it around. And to me, that's just, it's so nice to have this as a tool that you can use. And you can, you know, come up with complementary colors, which that kind of was, you know, kind of an orangey blue combo. But, you know, you could do yellows, reds, and things like that. So you can use this to really enhance the background and whatnot. Now, the other thing that I like doing, when I'm doing some of my illustrations for the kids' books or whatever it is that I'm doing, say that, let's make I'm going to make a blue pig. And so what I'm doing is I'm using he's a happy blue pig. Okay, so I'm using it a lot darker because this is kind of more of a graphic line. You know, I can put in a little bit of shading here and there. He's having so much fun. All right. Okay, so there he is. He's just, you know, throwing confetti up in the room. Okay, now because these are indexed, I can take, I don't know if I have my assortment will allow this, but I can take a similar pencil, trying to read my eyes. Okay, so that's a 110. This is a 110. So now I can kind of come through and do my shading with the watercolor pencil. Or I could use, you know, I could use an entirely different color, but this will kind of, all right. So it's kind of, you know, that look where you have a really strong graphic line. And then I'm kind of doing some nice shading here. There we go. Okay, so I'm happy with that. But to get a little more out of that, I can take my brush with a little bit of water. And so now I can get that watercolor to be flowing and move it around as long as I have a little bit of water on my brush. Then I could get it to move wherever I want in order to get, you know, kind of the shading that I want. And it's not going to affect the key drawing because that is oil-based. It's only going to affect where the watercolor pencil is going to go. So I've had tremendous fun using that technique because, yeah, if I get a little wild with it, I get so, like the pig, I'm just so happy that I'm not paying attention to what I'm doing. Then any part of that wash that falls outside of my keyed line, it doesn't make any difference because it stays the same because it's an oil base. And so that, you know, by the same token, let's see, let's make a, if I make, let's say, a duck.
Franz, is there a certain weight of paper that you suggest for using with the Albrechter or watercolor pencils in conjunction with the most?
Yeah, what I use generally is like a 300. If I'm using the water, in fact, you know, I kind of meant to show this, but I got so involved drawing pigs and everything. I guess because we were talking about pigment. This is a hot press, which is good for me. A hot press means that you can use, it's a real smooth surface, so you don't have that texture because you're intending it to be more for illustration, whatever. But this is about a 300 pound, I mean, like when I flick it, it's thick enough that you can hear it. And there, you know, all sorts of, there's a lot of paper made in watercolor pads where you can see that it has adhesive on 3 sides, so it keeps it down so that as you use water with your watercolor pencils, the paper is not going to start to become a potato chip. So I would say that with the watercolor pencils, 300 grams per metric meter or whatever works really nice. You know, there are certainly other papers that work nicely, but this also has sizing in it. And what sizing does with this is that, let's say, you know, for those who are not familiar, sizing protects the paper fibers. And so it's like a protective coating. So if I go ahead and layer this up with my Albrechter watercolor pencil and then hit it with some water, you know, I get that really luscious. What the sizing does is it gives you extra time. So if I decide, you know, I really don't want it that intense there, the fibers haven't totally absorbed the pigment yet. So before it dries and everything, I can put a brush on it and I can use a little bit of pressure, or I can use a cloth, or I use a chamois a lot of times. And I can get a lot of really nice effect by picking it up. So if you have a paper that doesn't have very much sizing in it, then the fibers of the paper would immediately suck that up and it would be very hard to lift off. So with watercolors, I like using a paper like this. And with my illustrations, a lot of times I'll use a pen. So I want a surface that won't snag my pen. I'll have, you know, a fluid drawing capability, but also really good at using the watercolor. So again, maybe this is a good time to, we'll get back to the idea of doing a duck here. So let me just quickly. Again, this kind of also illustrates, yeah, we're showing you some techniques for doing things that are a little bit more realistic, but these pencils are a hoot to use if you just want to have unmitigated fun with animals. Okay, so then, you know, I choose any number of my lovely Albrecht Durer colors here. This is a red-faced Eastern duck. You know, so you can use, yeah, in this case, they're complementary colors, you know, like this red and green combo here. And again, I can anticipate where I want the value to be. And because it's on this watercolor paper, I'll find some place where I can really load it up. Let's do it there. Okay, so now let's hit it with the old water. And the way that I like doing the watercolor, I like having a pool that I can then let flow. And yeah, these are so pigment. If I wanted to, if I had something else, I could pick it up and actually use it as a watercolor palette. And then, we could get, let's give him a green beak. That's a Christmas duck. How about that? Okay. I'm going to go out of the lines. I'll be bold. Maybe put some in through here. Okay, now if I wanted to, I can still, because this hasn't really set, I can put a little bit of water on that and then take a paper towel, or in this case, a chamois, and then I can pick some of that up. So if I decide that I want kind of more of a light highlight there, I can pick that up. Whereas, if it were more of a conventional paper, it might be harder to do that because it didn't have enough sizing. It didn't protect the fibers from, and the more sizing, the longer you have to be able to work before it is just totally set in the paper. So let's see, what else? I actually had, the one thing I wanted to mention, I mean, I was kind of working on some of these things ahead of time, because when the paper is wet with these Albrechter pencils, like, once I kind of put the initial value in there, let's say that I want to come back and I want to start making, some shadows and stuff. I want to make sure that that paper is absolutely dry, because if it isn't, if I'm working a pencil over that, it's going to tear the paper. It's going to start to flake things off, and you get these little kind of scrubby bits of paper. It doesn't mean that, somebody might have a whole method built on that effect. So it isn't like it is horribly wrong, but, if you don't want to damage the paper, you want to make sure that the paper is dry before you start going over it with some Polychromos. I mean, we could do that too. I could take one of my Polychromos, and if I wanted to put in some, shadow or something like that, it works really nicely as a shadow material on top of that light watercolor. So you can mix and match and do all sorts of stuff with these pencils. But you want to make sure the paper is absolutely dry so that you don't ruin the surface of the paper. All right. But, you can go back and, add some more water to it. I seem to have somehow, with this small area, here they are, covered up my brushes. So again, I just, the burst of color that you get with these things is just amazing. All right, so then, if I decided, okay, I'm going to finish, some of the shadows up with the Polychromos, then I want to wait for that to dry before I go back into it, because you don't want to scratch away or damage your paper. So, other than those things, I mean, we could be here all night. There's a lot, but I think that we pretty much hit the highlights of how to get you started with the pencils. The oil-based pencils are color indexed so that you can go back and forth with the colors between, and also they have pit pens and other materials that have the same pigmentation. So if you're really into doing multimedia approaches, this is an excellent system. The oil-based pencils, you can layer and layer. You don't have to worry about having the waxy pigment flake off. They're just a lot of fun to play with. And I think what I appreciate the most is that you're spending so much of your effort and your time, and if you're really passionate about what you're doing, you don't want to have to fight your materials. So, try to get the best materials you can in terms of the paper as well as your drawing or painting implements, because, if something happens and it doesn't look good, it's nice to know it might be something that you have to work on rather than have to guess, oh, is it me or is it the materials? So if you use, kind of bad materials, you're going to be not as happy. You won't get the bright colors you want. It'll be a little more frustrating. So, you're putting all that time and that effort, and it's something you really want to do. So treat yourself and just get, you don't have to get all 120 colors. Get, 26, 27, 28, 30, whatever, pick out the colors that you use. but enjoy it and don't fight the materials. So anyhow, are there any other final questions or anything else I can help anybody with? I think that we've covered a lot of the bases, and it's at least enough to get you started, and then we can do more at another time.
Well, friends, everyone in the chat has said that this has been a really great class, and they've actually
Good.
requested that we do an apple class so that we can show them how you drew that apple. So maybe that's something that we do at a later date.
Oh, yep. And especially now, everybody wants to keep the doctor away for sure. So we'll do
That's
the
right.
apple. We'll
It's
do
very
an
timely
apple.
for fall, for sure.
Yeah, we'll do an apple. That sounds great.
All right. Well, thank you everyone for joining us tonight.
Thank you, everybody. Go out and draw and have fun. Express yourself. Creativity is good for you.